The woman he destroyed became the mother of his only heir. Lorenzo Marchetti spent years believing Clara betrayed him, until the truth came too late. She was innocent, pregnant, and gone. When he finally finds her, she is no longer the quiet assistant who once loved him. She is stronger, colder, and fiercely protective of the child he never deserved to know. But when their son becomes a target, Lorenzo must prove he is not just a mafia boss, he is a father willing to burn the world down. The camera lingers on Clara, paralyzed in a heavy mahogany chair, her fingers white knuckling a silver pen. Before her rests a single sheet of paper on Lorenzo's shadowed desk. In this suffocating silence, it feels like an execution decree. Erasing 2 years of her life, she refuses to lift her gaze, knowing if she meets his frostbitten gray eyes, her facade will shatter. But the true agony of the frame hides beneath the desk, where her left hand presses protectively against her stomach. She is walking away with a secret that will plunge him into darkness for 6 agonizing years. It is a quiet tragedy that reveals a harsh truth. The secrets we desperately bury to protect ourselves are almost always the very blades that tear us apart in the end. Before you and I step further into this nightmare of obsession and ruin, please take a moment to subscribe. Let the lens pan up to the jagged cliffs of Milan, where a fortress of cold stone broods over the city. Inside sits Lorenzo, 36 years old, moving like a hollow ghost trapped in a tailored suit. At 22, he buried his father and inherited an empire soaked in blood. For 14 years, he has meticulously carved every ounce of warmth from his soul, convinced his heart is locked in an impenetrable vault. The stark lighting offers absolutely no comfort, mirroring his internal wasteland, but history teaches us a cruel irony. Believing you are completely untouchable by love is the fastest way to guarantee it will bring you to your knees when it finally strikes. Clara begins as merely a shadow in the background. For 3 months, she's a ghost in the corridor, quietly filing papers with her dark hair pulled tight, her eyes glued to the marble floor whenever Lorenzo sweeps past. But watch the subtle shift in the frame. The pivot of their existence happens the day the fear finally leaves her eyes. A soldier has botched a shipment, and behind heavy oak doors, Lorenzo is dispensing a violent penance. Clara sits merely inches from the punishment. She hears the crushing blows and ragged breathing, yet she remains firmly planted in her chair. A profound truth lies in her quiet stillness. True courage is not always found in fighting back. Sometimes, it is simply holding your ground when the rest of the world would scatter in terror. Anyone listening to that nightmare would have bolted, but Clara waits. When Lorenzo emerges, the camera catches the fresh blood staining his knuckles. She is terribly pale, her fingers trembling, yet she simply extends the folder toward him. No tears fall. She lifts her chin and meets his gaze directly, and this profoundly ruthless man freezes in his tracks. She is not looking at him like a monster. Her eyes pierce right through the ink spelling honor on his hands, reaching the deeply isolated boy trapped inside. He signs the document in a suffocating, heavy silence. From that precise second, he is completely ensnared. It reveals a devastating reality of the human condition. Even the most terrifying souls on this earth are simply starving to be genuinely seen for who they truly are. Let the cinematic light catch the sharp angles of Lorenzo. He is forged like a living weapon, draped in custom black suits that whisper of absolute dominance. Not a single dark hair shifts out of place. He is the visual embodiment of control, where one flick of those glacial gray eyes reduces hardened men to weeping children. Then there is the violent canvas of his skin. A dark Roman cross, entangled with a crowned serpent, bleeds down his neck. He intentionally leaves his collar undone, just enough to force the world to look at his lethal nature. But the camera sees right through the heavy armor. The heartbreaking truth of humanity is always this. The harder you build your exterior to look entirely unbreakable, the more it reveals how terrified you are of being shattered from the inside. His arms tell a sprawling, tragic story. They are wrapped in black ink, weeping angels, tangled rosaries, and a clock frozen at an hour he refuses to speak of. Then there is his violent moral code, the word honor, stamped across his knuckles. The tension peaks when he catches Clara studying his scarred hands. Her face holds zero disgust, only a profound sadness for his wounded soul. That single expression violently strips away his defenses. The great king stumbles as she gathers her coat. His voice cracks as he commands her to stay. It sounds like an order, but the pitch reveals the desperate plea of a drowning man. It offers a haunting lesson. We are so starved for true connection that one pure drop of empathy can wash away decades of carefully constructed emotional walls. Clara freezes by the heavy mahogany door, the dim amber glow of a desk lamp catching a flare of gold in her eyes. Lorenzo immediately spins a web of lies. He mutters about urgent ledgers and demands she take notes. It is a pathetic fiction. The suffocating silence of his massive office has begun to feel like a tomb, and simply hearing the soft rhythm of her breathing brings the cold room to life. She slowly sits back down. The clock ticks past midnight. Lorenzo does not read a single page. He just watches the elegant sweep of her pen, the slight crease of her brow, the way she tucks a dark curl behind her ear. We walk around convinced we are the absolute masters of our universe, until we suddenly realize we have been entirely conquered by the quietest details of another human being. The quiet shatters when he abruptly states she is not afraid of him. Clara halts her pen. Her posture remains calm as she asks if she should be. She tells him he wields fear like an iron shield, because the alternative is too agonizing to bear. When he challenges her to name that alternative, she holds his frozen gaze. She whispers it would mean letting the world see his bleeding heart. The camera captures the exact moment the king breaks. He should have cast her out, recognizing the threat of a woman who could decipher his shadow. Instead, he turns away, staring blindly into the night. It is a brutal life lesson. The people who possess the grace to see through our hardest defenses are the ones we desperately need, yet they hold the absolute power to destroy us. With his back turned, his voice drops to a hollow rasp, ordering her to leave. He listens to the rustle of her coat, the click of her heels. But at the threshold she lingers. He rigidly refuses to look. She whispers that whatever suffocating darkness he is dragging through this life, he no longer has to drag it alone. The heavy door clicks shut. Lorenzo remains paralyzed by the window, physically feeling the masonry of his heart cracking open. Over the next 90 days, the forbidden happens. The midnight hours stretch. His lethal armor dissolves, and he begins bleeding out the darkest sins of his youth. It proves a universal law you and I have all seen. No matter how deep you bury your trauma, genuine kindness will always find the tiniest fracture and tear your walls to the ground. Clara absorbs every agonizing frame of his past. She learns of a mother lost in childbirth, and a father who raised his boy with bloody knuckles. She hears the chilling confession of his first kill, at 17, a moment that carved out a hollow cavity inside his chest. Clara just sits in the shadows. She makes no attempt to play the righteous savior. One evening, her fingers resting mere inches from his, she whispers that he is not a monster. He is merely a boy who was never granted permission to be human. Lorenzo lowers his eyes to her wrist, hypnotized by the fragile pulse beating beneath her skin. It is a stunning realization sometimes. The most deeply broken souls on this earth do not need to be fixed or saved. They just desperately need to be heard, without the heavy gavel of judgment. You and I have seen this tragic arc before, but here is where the knife twists. He should have driven her away instead. He pulls her into his darkness. They become phantoms, stealing desperate moments in the margins of his violent empire. Clara sees the dark stains on his cuffs, but she also sees a broken man who worships her like a saint. But the camera angle tilts. They grow reckless. Although Lorenzo buried his father 14 years ago, that sadistic ghost still reigns over his psyche. Every time he softens toward Clara, his father's booming voice echoes in his skull, screaming that affection is a fatal disease. It is a devastating truth. The ghosts of the people who shattered us in the past will dictate our future, unless we find the raw strength to finally silence them. Flashback to his 16th birthday. A knife is shoved into the trembling boy's hands. His father sneers, swearing that love is merely a rusted chain. It tethers you to fragile things that can be killed, and when they bleed, you break. We do not break, his father hisses. We break them. Lorenzo treated that venom as scripture, building a terrifying dynasty on ice, but now, Clara is dismantling that fortress with a simple smile. The invincible king is unraveling. He slashes meetings short just to see her face. He spares traitors, terrified she might catch the scent of fresh copper on his skin. It is the bitterest irony of survival. When you construct your entire identity around being a ruthless monster, letting in a single drop of love feels like watching your world burn to the ground. Picture the scene. You and I are watching a slow tragedy unfold inside a dimly lit study. Marco, the aging head of security, stands in the doorway like a ghost. He watched young Lorenzo grow from a grieving boy into a merciless human weapon. But tonight, Marco notices the blade is dulling. Shadows stretch across Lorenzo's face as Marco states that Clara is a fatal liability. Lorenzo's jaw tightens, warning the old man to back down. But Marco does not flinch. He steps into the light, his voice a gravelly whisper, reminding the boss that rivals smell blood in the water. He is losing his edge. The lesson here is as old as Rome itself. When you sit on a throne built of bones, enemies will always find your softest spot. We often build walls to keep others out, only to realize we've locked ourselves in. Let the camera linger right here. Look closely at Lorenzo's hands. This is the undisputed king of the underworld. A phantom who cuts out tongues to make a point. Yet in this silence, he is merely a broken man staring blindly at a mahogany desk. A fountain pen bleeds dark ink into his expensive paper because Marco just struck his one raw nerve. The foot soldiers are already whispering that the boss has gone soft over a woman. In this brutal life, a rumor like that is a death warrant. Lorenzo raises his steel gray eyes, desperately trying to project ice, but a brief hesitation betrays him. The cruel irony of power is that the higher you build your fortress, the more terrified you become of the fall. No amount of money or fear can ever protect a person from the vulnerability of their own heart. Lorenzo barks a hollow threat, but a poisonous seed of doubt is already taking root. The camera cuts away. Gliding through the silent mansion to find Clara, she is locked in the cold marble bathroom, trembling as she stares at a positive pregnancy test. Her hands shake exactly as they did the night she heard a man begging outside Lorenzo's office. She holds fragile proof of new life. Yet the room feels suffocated by violence. You cannot nurture an innocent future inside a house cemented with secrets. She presses a cold palm against her stomach, terrified of the tiny heartbeat inside her. In their world, love doesn't offer salvation. It merely paints a glaring target on your back. It reminds us that we simply cannot force beautiful things to grow in poisoned soil. Watch Clara's desperate rationalization unfold, because this is where the human heart plays its cruelest tricks. You and I can see the tragedy forming, as she actually convinces herself that a baby could fix this fractured man. She knows Lorenzo's rule. Anything you love becomes a heavy iron chain around your neck. A child is a liability, yet she stares into the mirror, hoping this miracle will shatter his fortress of ice. It is utterly heartbreaking. We have all been there, haven't we? Believing our devotion is special enough to rewrite someone's nature. But she is gambling her child's life on a dangerous fantasy. The harsh truth is, you can never save a drowning man by handing him another heavy thing to hold. True rescue always has to start from within. The pacing of this next beat is an act of sheer cosmic cruelty. Clara makes the brave, painfully naive choice to tell him the truth. She chooses hope. But the universe holds no reverence for hope. At the exact second she turns the doorknob, Lorenzo's massive expansion deal violently collapses. 8 months of negotiations evaporate. An informant just handed names to the rival Ferraro family. It is a precise inside job, requiring unrestricted access to Lorenzo's private study. Life has a sad habit of unleashing its darkest storms the moment you dare look for the sun. Clara walks down the hall, stepping blindly into a room rigged with emotional explosives. It is a harsh reminder of how quickly terrible timing can turn a pure intention into a permanent, lifelong scar. The camera slows down. Every footstep echoes as Clara enters the office. The atmosphere is suffocating. 2 enforcers block the heavy oak doors behind her. Lorenzo sits rigid. The harsh lighting makes him look less like a man, and more like a gargoyle carved from grief. The accusation drops like a rusty guillotine. He genuinely believes she is the rat. He thinks every soft whisper in his bed was a calculated move to copy his ledgers. Clara begs, pleading with the man she loves to truly see her. But when a traumatized soul feels cornered, they will weaponize their paranoia against your devotion. Fear screams, love whispers, and Lorenzo listens to the screams. It is a tragic reality that people often project their deepest unhealed demons onto the very ones who love them the most. This is the frame that will absolutely gut you. She leans across the desk, swearing that someone planted the documents. The muscles in Lorenzo's jaw twitch. He stares at this woman, the singular source of light in his wretched existence, and spits out the word us, like it burns his tongue. There is no us. He snarls. There is only his bleeding empire and the traitor who held the knife. It is a sickening masterclass in self-sabotage. He is slaughtering his own salvation, because it feels safer to be betrayed than to admit he is vulnerable. But pay close attention to Clara. She does not collapse. She swallows her tears, squares her shoulders, and refuses to shatter. The most profound act of self-love is often simply walking away from someone else's chaos, with your dignity entirely intact. She attempts one final plea. The camera zooms in tight as she searches those steel gray eyes, desperately hunting for the vulnerable man who whispered his darkest fears at midnight. But he is gone, locked away inside a fortress of frost. Then comes the cruelest twist. Marco, the architect of this misery, steps out of the shadows. Lorenzo coldly instructs him to draw up the dismissal papers. The sheer absurdity is deafening. Here is a ruthless mafia don, severing his soulmate using sterile corporate paperwork, a non-disclosure agreement, and a blood money check. It is his cowardly method of sparing her life while legally erasing her existence. But you cannot buy absolution. It reminds us that no amount of wealth or hush money will ever bandage the deep wounds of a completely shattered heart. Let's sit in that heavy leather chair with her for a moment. She is in the exact spot where they first surrendered to love. Her palm resting secretly against her abdomen, she holds the truth that could halt this madness. But she knows the monster sitting across from her. If she confesses the pregnancy now, Lorenzo's poisoned mind will view their innocent child as a strategic hostage. He would see it as a desperate extortion play. So Clara silently swallows the words. She chooses to become the treacherous villain in his narrative, purely so she can be the fierce protector in her own. The heaviest chains we drag through this life are the painful truths we conceal to keep our loved ones safe. She is sacrificing her entire world today, so her baby can eventually inherit a truly peaceful one. The camera focuses tight on the heavy pen trembling in Clara's hand. Marco towers over her, an imposing symbol of lethal threat. She knows that if she lifts her chin, if she locks eyes with Lorenzo for a second, the emotional dam will shatter. She will scream the truth. But she knows exactly how this family disposes of liabilities. She refuses to let her unborn child become collateral damage in a paranoid turf war. So she presses the gold nib to the paper. She signs her name, legally anchoring herself to a lifetime of silence. She trades her soulmate for her son's right to breathe. The most profound sacrifices are rarely loud, heroic battles, usually. They are just the agonizing, quiet choices we make in the shadows to protect the fragile futures of those we deeply love. Clara walks out of those heavy oak doors without a single glance backward, and right there, bathed in the dim light of his empire, Lorenzo watches his actual salvation slip away. The tragic fool will not uncover the sheer magnitude of his mistake for 6 agonizing years. We follow Clara disappearing into the wind, from Milan to Florence, and washing ashore in a sleepy coastal town untouched by the mafia. She takes a mundane job crunching numbers. No silencers in the dark, no enforcers, just pure safety. It is a bitter irony how passionately we chase the fire of danger in our youth, only to realize the ultimate luxury is a profoundly boring Tuesday. True peace is often found when we finally stop running toward destructive flames and learn to simply appreciate the quiet. As the seasons change, the camera captures Clara's quiet metamorphosis. That suffocating passion she harbored for Lorenzo does not evaporate. Such immense energy is never destroyed, it merely changes shape. It hardens into a fierce maternal instinct. She forbids herself from mourning the man who discarded her. But you and I both know that fate possesses a dark sense of humor. The climax hits when her baby boy takes his first breath. Clara looks down, and staring back at her are Lorenzo's unmistakable, piercing steel-gray eyes. You can sprint to the edge of the earth to outrun your history, but eventually, it will manifest right in your arms. We can never truly escape our past. We must eventually find the courage to face it, even when it looks back at us through perfectly innocent eyes. Let's unpack this opening shot together. The room is dead quiet. Clara pulls her newborn tight against her chest, making a desperate promise. This boy will never inherit his father's blood-stained throne then. She makes a choice that is equal parts brilliant and heartbreaking. She names him Marco. To the world, it is a sweet Italian name. But the cinematic irony is deafening. Marco was the enforcer who erased her from Lorenzo's syndicate now. Every time she calls her son from the garden, an alarm bell rings in her head, forcing her to remember the heavy price of loving a monster. The scars we refuse to hide are often the only things keeping us from walking right back into the same fire, just like that. The screen fades to black and 6 years of hiding slip away. The camera catches Clara bathed in the cold light of her kitchen, 30 years old now. The terrified girl who stared at the floor of a crime boss's office is completely gone. In her place is a woman built of stone and grace. Heartbreak does not just break us, it rewrites who we are, teaching us that our deepest wounds eventually become our best armor. Her 5-year-old son, Marco, is living proof of that survival, yet a tragic shadow hangs over her daily routine. Marco is a chilling miniature of Lorenzo. He has that same brooding frown, that heavy quiet, and the instinct to instantly study a room the second he walks in. You can hide a young wolf among the flock, but the wild blood always remembers how to hunt. Listen to how the heavy silence settles over the room. Clara is rolling out pasta dough when the inevitable finally knocks. Marco stands right by the counter, asking the one question she has spent 5 years dreading. Why is his father missing? He is way too smart to just ignore the giant hole in their family. Clara forces a warm smile, repeating a rehearsed story about how families come in different shapes, looking anywhere but at his eyes. But the kid sees right through the thin lie, softly asking if he at least had a papa once. The camera lingers on her shaking hands. We try our hardest to shield kids from the ugly facts of the past, but we can never protect them from the aching emptiness left behind. The truth is a gathering storm, and it is going to drown them both. Let's freeze the frame right here. You and I have watched this exact kind of tragedy unfold before, but the heartbreak always hits just as hard. Clara pictures a ruthless mobster who would have used his own kid as a tactical pawn. She drops to her knees, whispering that her love will be enough to fill the space of 100 fathers. But Marco just stares back. The light catches his cold. Storm gray eyes, the exact eyes of the man who ruined her life. Clara swears she will only tell him the truth when he is older. It is a desperate illusion, proving that running from our demons only gives them more room to grow teeth, because back in the dark streets of Milan, 6 years of pure anger have completely warped Lorenzo Marchetti into something truly terrifying. Now watch the camera sweep back to the grand, suffocating estates of Milan. You would think that exiling the woman he thought betrayed him would finally bring Lorenzo some peace. Instead, it pushed him straight into a blackened pit. The fall of his crime family was only the beginning. He had zero actual proof of Clara turning on him, because, well, she never did. A person consumed by unhealed grief will often set the whole world on fire just to feel warm. Lorenzo drowned his massive pain in violence, turning into an unrecognizable nightmare. His own men stopped whispering about his flaws and started waking up in cold sweats just thinking about him. He stretched his brutal empire across 3 different countries, becoming a monster who never offered a second chance to anyone. Notice how the shadows stretch out as the sun sets over the estate. The ruthless mafia boss is left totally alone in his massive mansion, where the crushing silence slowly eats away at his mind. It is a masterclass in visual tragedy. He followed the bloody rules of his ancestors, cutting out the infection to save the family name. He did everything by the book. So why does he feel like he is bleeding to death on his own marble floor? True regret always shows up eventually to collect its debt. He hates himself, yet Clara haunts every breath he takes. In his nightmares, she is no traitor. She is the only person who looked past the violence and saw a broken man, the only woman who held his blood-stained hands without pulling away. He threw absolute loyalty straight into the flames. Pause the video right here, because this is where the universe delivers an absolute gut punch. Her soft voice echoes in his dark study, a ghost reminding him he never had to suffer alone. It takes 3 long years for his paranoia to finally order a real investigation. 6 months later, the truth drops like an axe. The actual informant was a low-level foot soldier named Dante, who sold them out and framed Clara. She was completely innocent the whole time. The truth is a brutal mirror, forcing us to actually look at the monsters we have turned into. The revenge he takes on Dante lasts for days, but it fixes absolutely nothing inside his hollow chest. He scrubs the fresh blood off his shaking hands, and the frantic, desperate search for the woman he threw away finally begins. The cinematic irony hits hard again. He is years too late. Clara pulled off a flawless vanishing act. The camera sweeps through a montage of dead ends, no forwarding address, no job records. Not a single digital footprint for his massive network to track. It is like she turned to smoke the second he kicked her out. The total lack of control drives him absolutely insane. He burns through piles of money, hiring elite trackers and shaking down contacts. But he is just chasing ghosts. All the worldly power you can gather is completely useless when you have already bankrupted your own soul. The almighty crime boss is left rotting on his throne, drowning in the fact that he destroyed the only real love he ever had. Karma is a very patient hunter, and it never forgets what you owe. Stick with me here, because the director sets up this twist of fate perfectly. Exactly 6 years to the day of her exile. Lorenzo is sitting in his freezing office. Out of nowhere, his phone screen lights up the dark. An anonymous text pops up with 4 massive pieces of info. Liguria, Rio Maggiore, the Bellini woman, a child. Just look at the tiny shift in his posture, the way his cold, mechanical heart flatlines for a second. A child. Time is the one judge that eventually forces all of us to answer for our buried sins. He drops his entire criminal empire and speeds out of the city in under 60 minutes, For 3 agonizing hours on the coastal road. His knuckles are bone white on the wheel, his broken mind terrified of what that one word means for his empty life. The camera locks onto his clenched jaw as his mind races through some torturous bargaining. Like, how old is the boy? Maybe Clara just married a nice guy from the village. Maybe the timeline is a massive coincidence. But the cold dread in his gut already knows the devastating truth. Intuition is really just the soul accepting what the brain is too scared to admit out loud. He finally pulls into Rio Maggiore, a stunning village hanging off the Italian cliffs. The streets are way too narrow for his armored car. Forcing the untouchable king to walk on foot like a normal person, he pushes into a tiny rustic bakery. The tired woman behind the counter takes one look at his heavy shadow, and her face drops into that universal, bone-deep exhaustion you only see when real trouble walks in. Lorenzo wears danger like a heavy coat, his custom suit and the harsh tattoos climbing up his neck scream of mafia violence. He says Clara's name, and the baker's defensive walls slam right up. She fiercely denies knowing the girl, telling him his kind has no place in her peaceful town. The lighting shifts beautifully here, casting his face in dark shadows as he leans over the glass. His cold eyes lock onto hers, vibrating with haunting desperation. Total desperation strips away all our titles, leaving only the bleeding human underneath. He swears he is not there to hurt anyone. He just needs the woman upstairs, and he will disappear. The brave older woman studies the deadliest man in Italy, finding only a ghost drowning in pure, crushing pain. The older woman finally gives in, but she makes sure to twist the knife. She hands over the address, glaring right at this monster, telling him he should burn with shame for whatever he did to that sweet girl. Lorenzo takes the verbal punch in total silence. Owning up to our own guilt is the heaviest weight any person will ever carry. He steps back out into the fading daylight, dragging his feet in a slow march like a man walking to his own grave. He finally finds the small apartment building, a bright little sanctuary covered in flower boxes and kids' toys. But suddenly his heavy boots stop dead on the pavement. He freezes right at the edge of the courtyard. There, glowing in the soft afternoon sunlight, is a little dark-haired boy, playing in the dirt. The whole world just stops. The lens creeps forward, forcing us to sit with the crushing weight of this shot. A boy squats in the dust, turning over a pale rock. Lorenzo, the ruthless syndicate boss, forgets how to breathe. The child lifts his head, and Lorenzo finds himself drowning in stormy gray eyes, a chilling mirror of his own damaged spirit. The crashing waves and the noise of the village melt into dead silence. Only 2 people exist right now, the blood-soaked king, and this tiny phantom wearing his exact face like a walking guilty verdict. It reminds us of a hard truth: no matter how fast you run, you can never escape the echoes of your own blood. The boy tilts his head, offering that same cold, calculating stare Lorenzo has practiced in his bathroom mirror 1,000 times before. With a devastating innocence, the boy simply asks who he is. The feared commander, a man who orders executions without a thought, cannot push a single word past his paralyzed throat. Then frantic footsteps shatter the spell. Clara calls out for her baby, her voice thick with panic, but the sound dies in her mouth the second she rounds the corner. She has played out this collision in her head for 6 agonizing years. It goes to show that the nightmares we brace for are nothing compared to ghosts breaching our safe havens. She freezes completely. Lorenzo stands there like a hollow shell, all the color drained from his face, his eyes glued to the child. The shot fades to black, just as Marco raises his small hand, pointing straight at the shattered crime lord. Today you and I are going to unpack this scene together. The camera zeroes in on Marco, tugging at his mother's dress, asking about the looming shadow in their courtyard. Clara acts on pure instinct. Her fingers grip his shoulder, her tone dropping into a razor-thin register of primal fear. It is the raw sound of survival, the exact shield that kept them alive for over half a decade. Marco reads the panic in her eyes and sprints inside. The heavy door clicks shut with the finality of a vault. Now they are completely alone. Clara turns to face the phantom who shattered her soul, yet unwittingly gave her the only thing she truly loves. The lens pans to Lorenzo. He is frozen. He drags his gaze from the door to her face. But he is no longer wearing the mask of a ruthless crime boss. There is zero malice left in his dark eyes. We see only the horror of a man realizing he missed 6 irreplaceable years of his own flesh and blood. He tries to speak, but the words turn to ash. The framing shifts to Clara. She lifts her chin and straightens her spine, a fierce portrait of defiance, masking the shaking of her hands. She fires her words like silver bullets. His name is Marco. He just turned 5 and yes, he He inherited those exact same piercing gray eyes. Then comes the fatal blow. She states the boy has no father, because the man who made him threw them out like garbage before Marco took his first breath. Lorenzo staggers backward. It teaches us that deep guilt hits harder than any weapon. His underworld armor shatters instantly onto the sun-baked cobblestones. The cinematic tension is thick enough to choke on. Notice the shift in Lorenzo's posture as he tries to play the victim. His voice cracks. Whispering she never gave him a chance to be a father, Clara erupts. The raw fury in her delivery is a masterpiece of pain. She throws the agonizing reality right back in his face. He dragged her name through the mud, branded her a traitor, and exiled her before she could defend herself. She steps up to the most dangerous man alive and demands the brutal truth. Would his paranoid mind have ever believed the boy was his? Or would he have seen an innocent child as just another rival scheme? Lorenzo's jaw turns to stone. The deafening silence teaches us that the harsh truth needs no defense. He has no answer. Because her tragic assessment is flawless. Stick with me, this is where the visual storytelling gets layered. This is the moment tragedy locks them into their fate. Clara holds his gaze, her voice dropping to a whisper. She tells him she simply did what was necessary. She became a fortress to protect their boy from his criminal empire and from the man himself. When the test arrived, Lorenzo chose his bloody throne over her devotion. He let pure paranoia blindfold his heart. It is a quiet truth of life that we all want our past mistakes to wash away, but the universe always collects its toll. Lorenzo finally whispers an admission of guilt. The words hit the stones like lead weights. Clara stands perfectly still. She knows his confession is genuine, but an apology today can never stitch up the bleeding wounds of those empty yesterdays. Clara unleashes her buried agony, every word cutting the air like shattered glass. She warns him that a sudden attack of conscience does not erase 6 brutal years of scraping by in the shadows. It does not hand their boy the father he deserved. Lorenzo's eyes drift to the window. Marco presses his hands against the glass, watching the emotional storm outside. Lorenzo's voice breaks as he begs to know his son. Clara cuts him off, stepping into his line of sight to block the boy from his world entirely. You cannot abandon someone to the dark and then stroll back into the light. Being a true parent requires showing up, not just sharing blood. She built an unbreakable sanctuary for her child. Completely walled off from the endless cycle of violence, Lorenzo leaves in his wake. She swears to defend that peace with her last breath. Lorenzo throws his hands up, begging her to believe he would never harm his own blood. Clara forces him to look at the collateral damage of his existence. His lifestyle is poison, rotting everything it touches, a harsh lesson he carved into her soul. The lens pushes in on Lorenzo's hands, shaking uncontrollably. Clara stares at those bruised knuckles, haunted by memories of kissing them, praying they belonged to a protector rather than a butcher. It highlights a devastating reality. We often fall blindly in love with a person's potential, rather than the truth of who they are. Broken, his shoulders caving in, he asks what she wants him to do. Her answer rings out like a gunshot. Pack up, go back to Milan, leave them alone. A tremor betrays Clara's voice. You can see the self-loathing in her eyes for showing any weakness. She reminds him that every choice breathes a consequence. Honestly, accepting that is often the most bitter pill we have to swallow. The camera pulls back, capturing them in the courtyard. They are 2 beautifully ruined people who destroyed one another. Standing across an invisible canyon of grief in that heavy silence, Lorenzo drops a match into the powder keg. He simply says no. Clara's breathing stops as she watches him regain his footing. He firmly states he will not turn his back and play dead. She is demanding he choose his mafia crown over his family for a second time. His jaw locks tight. He made that catastrophic mistake once, and he will burn down the world before making it again. Clara tries to remind him he forfeited the right to choose, but his broken voice slices through her armor. He looks like a man bleeding out, confessing he deserves nothingness. He discarded her when he was meant to be her shield. He swallowed the poison of syndicate lies instead of trusting his heart. For 6 years, he built a mountain of wealth that tastes like ashes. All because he slaughtered the connection that made him human. He takes a slow step forward. To her credit, Clara does not retreat an inch. He whispers he is not demanding instant absolution or claiming a family he hasn't earned. He just wants the chance to change. We must remember. True redemption is never found in a hollow apology. It is forged in the grueling labor of rebuilding the temple you burned down. You can see Clara forcing her tears down. She asks what happens if her answer remains a permanent no. Lorenzo's infamous mafia armor dissolves. leaving behind a terrifying vulnerability. He promises to stay anyway. He vows to buy a quiet house at the edge of the village and exist as a ghost, waiting decades if his penance requires it. He is not abandoning his boy, and he refuses to abandon her again. That promise is the final hammer blow. Clara shatters, crying out that he does not even love her. The accusation is heavy with 6 years of rotting baggage. Lorenzo freezes. She reminds him that through all their intimate nights, those words never once crossed his lips. It proves that assuming someone's devotion without hearing the truth is a silent poison that will destroy a human heart. Her voice shakes as she recounts how flawlessly he threw her away. She accuses him of confusing territorial possession with genuine affection. When he softly asks if she truly believes him to be that empty, she fires back that he was the very master who taught her that brutal lesson. Watch the camera linger on Lorenzo. The physical agony contorting his features is raw. His large hands hover helplessly, desperate to reach out but terrified to burn her again. Then the dam finally breaks. He tells her he loves her, the confession detonating like dynamite in the quiet garden. His voice fractures as he swears he loved her, even in the dark days. It is a hard truth sometimes the people who break us are simply the ones most terrified of being broken themselves. He confesses how he starved for the way she looked at him. In her eyes, he was never a monster, but simply a man. That fragile reflection terrified him so completely that he hunted for reasons to push her away. Clara meets his gaze and delivers the ultimate tragic irony to save his own skin. He chose to destroy her first. Lorenzo does not dodge the blade. He admits he acted exactly as his ruthless father trained him to, cutting out his only vulnerability. A suffocating silence floods the space. Little Marco watches from the glass, a silent ghost in a shattered home. Clara stands paralyzed. It leaves us with a haunting reality. Our desperate fear of vulnerability often makes us become the exact monsters we spend our lives trying to escape. You and I must look at this next beat closely. She spent 6 bleeding years starving for those words, burying that hope in a shallow grave. Now that his declaration hangs in the air, there is no grand relief. She only feels a violent assault on the fortress walls she built to survive him. Her face grows blank, and her voice goes flat as she points him to his hotel, refusing to stage a war in front of their child. Lorenzo begs for a timeline. Clara raises her trembling hand like a shield. She needs time to explain to a young boy that his phantom father materialized only because he finally decided they were worth his effort. It reminds us that an apology delayed by years often feels less like healing, and much more like a brand new wound. The lens zooms in on Lorenzo closing his eyes, a muscle feathering in his jaw as the agony registers. Clara watches him bleed. Glad to let him carry the heavy stones for once, defeated, his shoulders slump. He names the local inn, murmuring a vow to wait until the end of time. Before walking away, she stands motionless, watching him fade into a quiet village, meant to lock out predators like him. The camera follows her dread-filled steps inside. Little Marco sits perfectly still on the worn couch. He does not ask a single question. He simply states the shadow outside was his papa. It is a haunting beauty how effortlessly children cut through our darkest lies, no matter how hard we try to build walls to hide reality. The innocent always seem to see the plain truth the clearest. The dim lamp cast heavy shadows as the boy pointed out a ghost, whispering that they shared the exact same eyes. Clara felt a chill, realizing her son carried a dangerous intuition. She pulled him onto her lap, desperate for the grounding weight of his body against her chest. Breathing in the scent of his hair, she confessed the crushing truth. Yes, that man was his father. When Marco asked why she sent him away, she fumbled for words, mumbling about a complicated past. Then came the wreckage. Marco looked down, asking softly if his dad just did not want him. It is a brutal lesson we all eventually learn. The deepest cuts in life often come from the innocent questions of those we love, forcing us to suddenly face the painful truths we try so desperately to keep buried. Her voice trembled as she swore his father never knew he existed. Clara stared into a flawless reflection of Lorenzo's brooding face. Confessing she hid the truth to keep him safe. The reality of blood-stained streets and merciless syndicate wars hung heavy in the quiet room. She merely promised to explain it all someday. Marco absorbed this with a haunting maturity, asking quietly if the man would return. Clara could only stammer, drowning in sudden anxiety. Then the little boy reached out to steady her shaking hand, whispering that she wore her thunderstorm face. It is a profoundly humbling truth. We spend years faking bravery to shield our children from the harsh weather, only to find they are the ones holding an umbrella over us when our world finally breaks apart. Marco declared he needed to meet the man. Clara choked back a sob, asking what he would even say. The boy delivered a heartbreaking list. He wondered why his father carried such sorrow in his eyes, what the ink on his hands meant, and if he liked bugs. Then came the crushing blow. He wanted to ask if the man was sorry for making his mother cry. Clara did not feel her tears falling until Marco wiped them away, across town. Lorenzo sat paralyzed by a dusty inn window, staring blindly at the coastal lights. The reality of a son had shattered his dark universe entirely. It reveals a simple truth we all must face at some point. You can run from your enemies for the rest of your life, but you can never truly escape the living consequences of the love you leave behind. Look closely at Lorenzo right now. He cannot stop seeing that little boy. The child has his exact searching eyes, blended with Clara's quiet resilience. His name is Marco, an irony sharp enough to draw blood. Did Clara name her son after the man who drafted her dismissal papers? She was always sharp like that. Suddenly, his phone vibrates. It is the original Marco, his security chief. Lorenzo ignores it, but 3 desperate calls light up the screen. Then comes the text that ruins everything. The rival Ferraro family is making a move. He must return to the violence he abandoned. This brings us to a simple truth we all face. You might believe you can just walk away, but your unhealed past has a ruthless way of dragging you right back into the dark. Today, you and I are going to unpack this tragedy together. Picture the stark horror on Lorenzo's face as his blood runs cold. The Ferraro family. The very ghosts who framed Clara 6 years ago are moving again. His phone rings, and Marco sounds like a man walking on a live wire. The old boss's son took over recently, desperate to prove he is a true monster. They intercepted dark, violent chatter. The kid is planning something massive, and for Lorenzo it is deeply personal. Lorenzo spent years fighting shadows, only to realize they were just waiting for him to blink. You can never outrun a history that refuses to die. The difficult lesson we all face is that genuine peace only arrives when you stop running and decide to confront the demons you left behind. Watch the panic set in. Lorenzo asks about the threat, and Marco hesitates. That brief silence is everything. The enemy is hunting anyone tied to Lorenzo's past. He feels the floor vanish beneath his feet. His voice drops to a dangerous whisper, ordering double security and demanding they track the rival's every move. Marco asks for his location, but Lorenzo just hangs up. He stands frozen by the window for an hour, consumed by a raw terror he has not known in years. This is the tragedy of control. The higher the walls you build, the more you stand to lose when they fall. He is no longer a king, just a terrified man staring at a world he might destroy. We all learn that true strength is never about power. It is about what you are willing to sacrifice to keep the people you love safe. Picture the scene. Alessandro Ferraro is hunting ghosts, searching for Clara and the son Lorenzo barely knows. The morning light is cold. Clara shuffles to the door, unaware her quiet existence is over. She turns the deadbolt, and there he stands, Lorenzo. The once untouchable boss looks hollowed out. His suit is ruined, shadows bruising his eyes. The frantic energy rolling off him makes Clara's blood run cold. He begs to step inside, his voice a desperate rasp, asking if Marco is awake. He pushes past her, eyes darting to the windows, calculating escapes like a trapped wolf. He came to protect them. But his shadow drags the devil right to her door. It teaches us a painful truth. The people trying the hardest to save us are often the ones pulling us directly into the fire. Watch how 2 broken people try to survive the same room. Checking the street for snipers is just muscle memory for Lorenzo. Clara swallows her panic, keeps her spine rigid, and offers him coffee. He shakes his head, telling her to sit. Her walls slam up. She crosses her arms, reminding him she stopped taking his orders long ago. Lorenzo closes his eyes. You can physically see the guilt crushing his lungs. He softens his tone, pleading with her to listen. He remains standing, shoving his hands into his pockets to hide his trembling fingers. Then he finally says it. 6 years ago, when he accused her of betrayal, he was completely wrong. It takes true ruin for a proud man to swallow his ego. We all learn that saying sorry means nothing when the emotional damage is already permanent. Clara knows he was entirely wrong, delivering this truth with cold indifference. But Lorenzo twists the knife, confessing the real traitor was Dante. Secretly working for the Ferraro family, their strategy was to rip his empire apart, and framing Clara was simply an easy move on the chessboard. The blood drains from her face as she realizes she was the actual target. Lorenzo explains she was his perfect weakness, the only soul he truly trusted. Breaking that trust tore his world to shreds. When she demands to know why he brings this up now, his voice drops. He killed Dante 3 years ago. The tragic reality of human nature is that we think vengeance will heal our broken hearts. But destroying the person who ruined your life never puts the pieces back together. It only leaves you staring at your own bloody hands. Lorenzo holds her gaze, his eyes pooling with dread as he whispers that the nightmare is just beginning. The Ferraro bloodline survived. And the new heir is asking lethal questions about the only woman Lorenzo ever loved. The words strike Clara like a physical blow. She forces out the question she dreads most. Do they know about their son? Lorenzo swallows hard, admitting it is possible slowly. His hollow eyes drift down the hallway, locking onto Marco's bedroom door. The silence turns suffocating before Clara erupts. Driven by pure maternal instinct, she screams that he will not drag his bloody wars into her safe haven. You can run as far as the map allows, and build a quiet life in the shadows. But the hard truth is that your past choices will always track you down, no matter where you hide. This is the exact moment the oxygen leaves the room. Lorenzo lowers his voice to a grave whisper. If Alessandro discovers Marco, their innocent boy becomes a pawn in a generational blood feud. Clara vibrates with uncontrollable rage. She points to the door, demanding he go back to Milan and play dead to protect their child. Lorenzo just stands there, resembling a shattered stone monument. He tells her the hunt has already started, and running away now will only leave her defenseless. She snarls that she survived for 6 years without his protection. Lorenzo pulls his trembling hands from his pockets, looking at her with brutal clarity. Hiding in the dark only works until someone flips the switch. The hardest lesson in this life is realizing that simply closing your eyes does not make the monsters disappear. Let us take a closer look at this shift in power. Clara finally buckles, falling into the chair as her mind races through the nightmares she spent 6 years praying against. Her voice is barely a ghost when she asks what he wants. Lorenzo drops to a crouch, forcing himself beneath her eye level. The ruthless boss strips away his pride, begging to protect them. He promises to blanket the village with his men, constructing an invisible fortress around her life. Suspicious, she demands his price. Lorenzo swears there is no catch. He refuses to use this terror to force his way into Marco's life. He simply wants them to survive the coming storm. It is a haunting expression of devotion. The truest form of love is not always holding someone tight. Sometimes it is building a high wall around them, even if you must stand on the outside forever. The camera pushes in on Lorenzo as he makes his heavy vow. He promises that once the threat is dead, he will vanish forever, but right now, he absolutely refuses to leave them exposed. Clara stares him down, scanning his rigid face for the usual manipulation. Yet the tragic reality is that all she finds is the exact same terrifying panic she feels every time she looks at her vulnerable son. She reluctantly agrees, her voice trembling as she lays down the ultimate boundary. His guards must remain ghosts, and Marco cannot know a single thing. Most importantly, Lorenzo is strictly forbidden from playing the father. He simply nods, accepting his bitter exile. It is a quiet, devastating tragedy. Sometimes the heaviest punishment on this earth is standing mere inches from the soul you love, permanently forbidden from ever reaching out to touch them. Notice how the ambient noise of the street entirely drops away in this specific shot. Clara leans in, the soft morning light hitting her face. But her eyes turn to pure, unforgiving steel. She is a mother pushed to the absolute brink of sanity. With a voice barely above a harsh whisper, she swears to him that if he dares to go behind her back, if he so much as breathes a single hello toward that little boy without her explicit blessing, she will end him herself. The threat is not, let us pan across what looks like a sunny, peaceful dream of a neighborhood. But if Clara did not know how to read the shadows, she would never notice the watchers lingering at the edges. A woman jogging just a little too slowly past the local bakery. A fisherman with a suspiciously perfect view of her wooden door. Visually, it is textbook perfection, yet beneath the surface, Clara is suffocating. For 6 quiet years, she tasted real freedom, raising her boy entirely removed from the Mafia underworld. Now the heavy cage has returned. The brutal irony is that she has to step inside that cage and lock the door herself. We often think freedom is merely a place on a map. But the reality is that true freedom only exists when you can finally stop looking over your shoulder. The camera pulls into a cramped-in room, now a tense counseling center. Shadows hide the exhaustion on Lorenzo's face, lit only by the cold glare of encrypted monitors. He speaks into a secure line, absorbing Marco's frantic updates from Milan. The youngest Ferraro is out there hunting, tearing through old archives to find a fatal weakness. Lorenzo clenches his jaw. He swore he burned every trace of Clara to ash years ago. but Marco delivers a chilling reminder of their dark reality, proving that human memory outlives any deleted file. You can try to burn your history, but the lesson here is absolute. Secrets are exactly like water. No matter how tightly you clench your fists, they will always find the narrowest fracture to bleed through. The shot shifts to Lorenzo at the window, sunlight catching the dust around his dark silhouette, down in that maze of cobblestone streets. His own flesh and blood sits at a kitchen table, asking questions Clara cannot safely answer. The boy only wanted to know the sound of his father's voice. That simple wish shatters Lorenzo more completely than any bullet ever could. His child spent 5 agonizing years growing up fatherless now. He is merely 50 meters away. Yet Lorenzo is barred from offering even a simple morning greeting. A king who commands thousands of lives is entirely powerless over his own. It is a harsh reminder. All the power and wealth in the universe amount to absolute zero when you are forbidden to hold the people you love. The tension here is absolute. You and I can both feel the walls closing in. Lorenzo barks vicious commands at his crew. Frantic to outrun the coming slaughter, Marco begs him to show restraint, warning that if the Ferraros discover why Lorenzo hides in this village, their world ends. The line goes dead. The camera lingers on Lorenzo before his posture hardens. He refuses to wait for the executioner. The scene cuts sharply to Clara, guiding her son to school. Just as Lorenzo emerges from the mist, the breathtaking climax arrives. Little Marco sees the man first, his bright eyes widening with pure recognition. We learn a brutal truth today. You can build iron fortresses to hide your past, but fate will always find a way to bring those walls crashing down. Let the camera freeze on this exact frame. Pause the movie right here and study the agonizing distance between these 3 souls. Notice the stiff, panicked angle of Clara's shoulders as her maternal instinct screams to flee. Look at the trembling in Lorenzo's jaw. A man who has violently dismantled criminal empires is now entirely paralyzed by a small boy in a school uniform. The morning light casts an unforgiving shadow across the pavement, splitting their 2 worlds. It is a masterpiece of unsaid agony, suspended in absolute silence. Moments like this offer a profound lesson. Sometimes we must forcefully stop the moving picture of our lives to truly see the damage we carry. The hardest battles are never fought with weapons, but with the haunting gravity of enduring love. The camera captures the quiet brutality of this encounter. Clara stands rigid, a fragile shield blocking her son from the dark reality of his father. She crouches low, her voice quivering, begging little Marco to walk the rest of the way alone. Lorenzo, a hardened enforcer, stands rooted to the earth, entirely paralyzed. The boy glances between the adults, sensing the heavy tension in the air. He nods quietly and takes a few hesitant steps. Then he stops, turning back to study the towering stranger. Life operates with a cruel irony. We exhaust our souls running from our mistakes, only to find our history staring right back at us through the pure eyes of our children. It teaches us a painful truth. The ghosts we desperately try to outrun are often the very ones we breathed life into. Look at the quiet tragedy unfolding here. The boy points at the mobster's inked hands, whispering that his drawings are nice. It is a moment of pure innocence, blind to the fact that those very hands have ruined countless lives. The camera lingers on Lorenzo's fractured expression. He blinks, completely disarmed, murmuring a hollow thank you. The second the school doors close, the tension shatters. Clara turns on him, her fury boiling over at his reckless visit. Lorenzo slices through her panic with a dead, empty tone. Time has officially run out. They retreat to a quiet cafe, hiding in the long shadows. It reminds us of a hard truth we all face eventually. The walls we spend years building to keep the monsters out often become the exact cages that trap us when real danger finally knocks. Let us sit with the heavy dread of this cafe scene. Lorenzo orders a coffee that remains entirely untouched. Clara sits rigidly across from him, demanding that he speak. The camera pushes in as he delivers the fatal blow. Ferraro has made his move, sending enforcers to terrorize Daniela, an old accountant from Lorenzo's dark past. Clara's blood turns to ice. Daniela was a gentle woman who always smiled at her. What did she reveal under pressure? Absolutely everything. She spoke of Clara vanishing into the night. It proves the ultimate tragedy of trying to bury your history. You can burn every bridge to ash and cover your tracks flawlessly, but you can never erase human memory. In life, it is always the smallest, forgotten detail that brings the massive house crashing down around us. Lorenzo keeps his cold eyes completely dead, offering a masterclass in chilling restraint. He leans into the dim lighting, whispering that Daniela noticed Clara looked pale, perhaps even pregnant, right before she vanished. He does not even need to finish the sentence. Clara presses a trembling hand firmly over her mouth. They know, suspicion is a terrible poison. One that makes greedy men dig through endless records to find her boy. When Clara chokes back a bitter sob, terrified they will use her son against the mobster, Lorenzo corrects her with gentle devastation. It is about both of them now. Here is the tragic reality we all must eventually face. The exact second you start caring about someone more than your own breath, you hand the unforgiving world the perfect weapon it needs to destroy you. Let us examine how beautifully twisted this game has become. Ferraro is driven by a reckless hunger. Taking young Marco would serve as a bloody billboard to the underworld, proving the untouchable Lorenzo bleeds just like any other man. Lorenzo leans across the table, not touching her, but letting his heavy shadow blanket her panic. He delivers the bitter truth without flinching. The quiet days of hiding are entirely over. They must run to a secure fortress today. Clara shakes her head, tears spilling as she begs for their simple home. Lorenzo crushes her hope with cold math. A normal life means nothing if the child is buried. It teaches us all a harsh lesson. Clinging to a comfortable illusion is the most dangerous mistake you can make, when reality is busy kicking down your door. Those cold words strike her chest like a physical blow. 6 hard years of clawing for a peaceful life, completely wiped clean by a brief conversation over cooling espresso. When she desperately asks where they could go, he answers with just one word: Milan, his sprawling estate. Clara lets out a broken laugh that shatters the quiet air. The irony is suffocating. He expects her to drag their innocent child straight into the beating heart of his criminal empire. Lorenzo remains perfectly still, claiming his walls offer absolute security. She knows they will merely be locked inside his golden cage until Ferraro is gone. Life often forces this terrible hand upon us. Sometimes, the only way to survive a deadly storm is to walk straight into the center of it. Even if you lose a piece of your soul, you can hear the heavy metal bars snapping shut around her. Clara spent her adult life running from this violence, only to realize the monster is now her only shield. She begs for time, her voice cracking loud enough to draw curious stares. She whispers that he is demanding her trust after every terrible thing he has done. This is the frame that truly breaks your heart. Lorenzo quietly bows his head. He knows he does not deserve a single ounce of her grace. He asks anyway, because the alternative is waiting for assassins to arrive. It reminds us of a dark truth about the human condition. The hardest choices we face are never simply between right and wrong. They are a brutal choice between 2 different kinds of agony, and deciding which pain you can actually bear to carry. Picture this opening frame with me. Clara presses her hands against the mahogany table, knuckles white, desperate to hide her trembling wrists. She attempts to dictate terms to a king of the underworld, demanding that little Marco remain shielded from violence. She speaks of boundaries and returning to a normal life, as if negotiating a simple lease. But you and I know the bitter truth. You cannot dip just one toe into a river of blood. You either stay safely on the shore, or you let the dark water pull you under. Clara believes she is shielding her boy, but she is hand-delivering him to the exact monster she fled. Watching her cling to this fragile illusion of control is absolutely heartbreaking, reminding us that blind denial is often our most dangerous human flaw. The camera pushes in on Lorenzo. Notice the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, a microscopic fracture in his marble exterior. He quietly asks what happens to his bond with his son once the smoke clears. Clara has been running from this reality since his shadow first fell over her courtyard. She breathes out her terror, admitting she does not know if his presence will save Marco or utterly destroy him then. Her icy stare softens just a fraction. She tells him she knows he chose to come warn them. It is a fatal miscalculation. She completely mistakes a cold tactical maneuver for a beating human heart. The harsh lesson here remains firmly written in stone for all of us to remember: a single fleeting moment of grace does not ever erase a violent lifetime spent hunting in the dark. The lighting grows colder as she digs her tragic grave. She praises the mobster, whispering that he could have taken them by force but chose to ask. She looks at the man who shattered her life and genuinely believes his soul is cleansed. Then comes the devastating blow. Her little boy wants his father as she confesses Marco's fragile hopes. Lorenzo's impenetrable mask shatters, exposing a raw vulnerability beneath the surface. Clara draws a trembling breath and seals their doom, promising to figure it out together once they are safe. The sheer irony is suffocating. She believes they are joining forces to wait out a passing storm, entirely blind to the fact that he is the hurricane. It reminds us of a fatal human flaw. Unchecked hope can often be the most dangerous poison we consume. 3 hours later, the steel jaws of the trap officially snap shut. They tear down the highway toward Milan in Lorenzo's armored, rolling vault. In the back seat, Marco presses his face against the tinted glass, watching the sunlit countryside dissolve into a blur. Clara sits rigidly in the passenger seat, her spine tight enough to snap. The boy breaks the heavy silence, his small voice echoing in the cabin as he asks why the car is so massive. In the rearview mirror, Lorenzo's dark eyes meet his son's reflection. He answers softly that he needs a big car to protect important things. Stick with me, and let us look at this together. The innocent boy thinks he is embarking on a grand adventure, entirely unaware that he has just stepped inside his own mobile prison. Children possess a ruthless instinct for truth, and Marco presses deeper into the wound. When Lorenzo speaks of protecting what he cares for, the boy delivers a devastating strike of innocence. He asks if his father cares about his mother. The atmosphere in the car instantly thickens. Clara freezes, her breathing suspended. Lorenzo grips the leather wheel as if he is drowning and whispers a desperate yes. The boy offers no mercy, demanding to know why he abandoned them for so long if he cared so much. The innocent accusation suffocates the heavy air. Lorenzo absorbs the blow without flinching, confessing he made a terrible mistake that he regrets every day. It proves a powerful lesson. Even the most terrifying monsters will eventually fall to their knees before a child's simple truth. The boy delivers profound wisdom with casual grace. Noting that apologies do not fix broken things, but they matter, Lorenzo solemnly agrees. When the child asks if he will keep trying, Lorenzo holds Clara's gaze in the mirror and promises to try for as long as it takes. The tension breaks as the iron gates of the estate loom into view. It is a sprawling, shadowed villa carved into the hillside. Marco gasps in pure wonder, calling it a grand castle. Lorenzo softly corrects him, noting its history. Clara remains silent, her knuckles white. She knows the grim reality of this architecture. It leaves us with a haunting lesson about human perception. A beautiful castle is often merely a romantic word for a cold stone fortress designed to keep its desperate prisoners trapped inside. The camera slows before the heavy iron gates, framing the subtle tremor in Clara's fingers. Years ago, she was a ghost on these streets, ignored by these same men. Today she sits behind tinted glass, caught in a terrifying limbo. Is she an honored queen, a hostage, or the mother of a future boss? It points to a strange truth about our lives. The ordinary places we once hurried past often become the exact cages we cannot escape. Lorenzo tells her to wait, his voice heavy with dread. Before stepping into the dusk, he trades a silent look with his head of security and pulls the heavy door wide for his boy. Young Marco steps onto the crushed gravel, his pale eyes quietly absorbing the shadows of a dark empire he never asked to inherit. Picture this massive compound of cold stone, packed with armed guards pretending not to be on edge. Right in the middle of this organized violence stands a tiny boy. Exhaling a quiet breath of wonder, Lorenzo drops to one knee, shedding his boss persona to play the gentle father, and introduces Marco to the scarred head of security. The boy looks up at this hardened enforcer, and happily points out that they share the exact same first name. Stick with me here, because what happens next is pure poetry. You can literally watch the old mercenary's frozen expression thaw, a real, tender smile breaks across his ruined face. It serves as a beautiful reminder for all of us. No matter how thick the walls we build around our hearts, unfiltered innocence will always find the tiniest crack in our armor. The first week inside this golden prison blurs into a heavy mix of luxury and silent panic. Clara and her son are locked inside a massive wing, staring out at perfect gardens that feel as fake as a movie set. Lorenzo vanishes during the daylight hours, fighting an invisible war, but he never misses their evening meals. Young Marco adapts to this routine without a second thought. To him, his dad is just a quiet man with sad eyes and cool drawings all over his arms. The kid reaches out, traces the dark lines, and asks what they are for. Lorenzo gently explains that the tattoos help him keep track of the things that matter most. It is a heavy moment that speaks volumes. We all carry the weight of our past, but some people choose to permanently carve their biggest mistakes right into their own flesh. The boy refuses to drop the subject, pressing his father to explain exactly what he needs to remember. Watch the nervous shine on Lorenzo's face as he scrambles to turn a life of violence into a soft fairy tale. He tells his son the ink reminds him to keep his family safe. Even when the job gets hard, Marco instantly thinks of Clara, happily announcing that his mom keeps him safe even when she is scared. Then the boy completely dismantles the crime boss in a single breath. Looking up with those exact same gray eyes, he innocently asks if his dad is good at not being afraid. This scene is an absolute masterclass in tension. It teaches a sharp lesson about the masks we wear. You can build the thickest walls of stone, but a child will always see the raw fear hiding right behind your eyes. In this perfectly silent moment, the feared boss completely falls apart. Lorenzo looks down at his son, admitting in a broken whisper that he is deathly afraid of failing the people he loves. With the simple logic of a 5-year-old, Marco suggests his parents team up to protect each other. Clara feels her exhausted heart break, and then slowly stitch itself back together. Lorenzo meets her wet eyes and softly agrees, but happiness is a rare visitor in this life. Just 3 days later, a rival crew bombs Clara's old apartment into dust, missing her by a narrow margin. The irony here carries a heavy truth for anyone watching. The fragile line between losing everything and getting a second chance is often just a matter of blind, lucky timing. Let us take a closer look at what happens when the walls finally close in. That smoking crater of an apartment proves the enemy is out for blood. While their son sleeps down the hall, Lorenzo pulls Clara into a dark corridor to deliver the crushing news. He tells her the rivals know she is his ultimate weak point. Those massive gates out front are no longer keeping danger out. They are locking the targets inside. If she steps onto the sidewalk, she is dead. Clara's chest heaves as panic sets in, asking how long they have to stay buried in this tomb. Lorenzo's expression goes entirely flat, admitting they are stuck until he wipes the other family off the map. It is a harsh reality check. We all like to think we can outrun our past mistakes, but eventually the bill always comes due. Clara rolls that hollow word over her tongue. Ended. She stares at the man she never stopped loving, realizing he is casually discussing an execution. This mechanical approach to murder is the exact poison she fled 6 years ago. Panic bleeds into her voice as she asks if putting a bullet in this man will finally kill the nightmare. Lorenzo looks away. Carrying the exhausted weight of his 36 years drowning in blood, he confesses the devastating truth. There is always another monster waiting in the dark. You and I know how this works. Violence is never a faucet you can simply shut off once you get what you want. It is a merciless ocean, and there is a real lesson here. Trying to solve your deepest pain by hurting others only traps you in the very storm you are trying to escape. The camera pushes in slowly, catching the cold light in the eyes of Lorenzo as he swears to take every bullet meant for them. He calls them his family. That single word hangs in the stagnant air, heavy as lead. 6 years ago, Clara fled into the night with his child. Certain he was merely a dark reflection of his brutal father. Now under the flickering shadows, he offers her the dream she always wanted. Though it comes wrapped in barbed wire and inevitable violence, it is a quiet, devastating tragedy. He cannot offer her peace, only his blood and protection. We learn a bitter but beautiful truth in this frame. Real love almost never arrives in a pristine, perfect box. True devotion is born in the wreckage, offered by broken people bleeding to be better than they were yesterday. Let us look closely at Clara in this scene. She simply shatters. The camera lingers on her trembling shoulders, as she confesses she does not know how to love a man carved from a mountain of blood. Lorenzo refuses to push her. He closes the distance just enough for their shadows to merge, respecting the chasm between them, asking to earn back the grace he destroyed. Clara is paralyzed by the fear that this love is merely a gilded cage. He raises a scarred hand, pausing, giving her every second to step away. When she holds her ground, his knuckles barely graze her tear-stained cheek. It reminds us of a hard truth about human connection. Trust is never magically restored overnight. It is a fragile bridge that must be rebuilt over a terrifying abyss, one painful plank at a time. The cinematic armor falls away from Lorenzo, leaving him entirely exposed. His voice drops to a jagged whisper as he admits the darkest truth. If he truly wanted to own her, he would lock her in his fortress and use their son as a human chain. That was the toxic legacy he used to mirror. But as the pale light hits his face, he vows he is ready to watch her walk away forever if it brings her peace. The man is bleeding his soul out. Clara fights a losing battle against her tears, feeling the glacial walls around her heart fracture as she finally leans into his touch. It is a breathtaking surrender. We see a profound life lesson here about genuine devotion. The truest form of love is holding the power to cage someone, yet choosing to leave the heavy iron door wide open. We cut to 2 weeks later, and the tension finally snaps. Ferraro does not use lead and powder to strike instead. He weaponizes a far deadlier element, the brutal truth. He broadcasts the devastating secret across the bleeding underbelly of the city. In an instant, the myth of the untouchable Lorenzo shatters, revealing a hidden heir and a phantom lover. The camera sweeps through smoky backrooms as the news ignites like a wildfire. Loyalists step into the shadows, and every bottom-feeding thug dreams of wearing the fallen king's crown. Stick with me, because this forces us to confront a terrifying reality about our own lives. Your greatest weakness is rarely a physical flaw. The most lethal blade anyone can wield against you is a precious secret you spent your entire existence trying to bury. In the harsh daylight, Lorenzo wears the mask of a ruthless monarch, but at 3 a.m, the lens captures his quiet collapse. Clara finds him bathed in the cold blue light of his study, bowing under the weight of a doomed empire. She pleads with him to weave a lie, to bury the boy in myth and keep him safe. But Lorenzo knows the truth is already hunting them, so he makes a chilling, monumental wager. He chooses to drag his son into the glaring light, crowning little Marco as his absolute heir, daring the wolves to strike. This teaches us a simple lesson about survival. When the hurricane reaches your doorstep, hiding only digs your grave faster. The only way to conquer a nightmare is to walk straight into the fire and own your truth completely, no matter the cost. You and I can see the absolute madness framed in this single shot. Clara stares at Lorenzo, horrified. It is dawning on her that he is painting a blood-red target right on the back of their 5-year-old boy. But Lorenzo does not sugarcoat it. He softly delivers the grim irony of their situation. The crosshairs are already locked. The only choice left is whether the child cowers in the shadows or stands under the floodlights. Wrapped in armor, he grips her trembling shoulders. With that one physical touch, the fantasy of a quiet life turns entirely to ash. They have to walk through the fire hand in hand now. It exposes a haunting reality about our deepest choices in life. You can never unring the bell, once your innocence burns away. You just have to hold tight and brace for the impact. Notice how the camera holds steady on his weathered face. Lorenzo strips away all demands for her heart. He is just making one final, tragic plea. He begs Clara to stand by his side in the mud while he sets the city ablaze, just to keep their child breathing, once the ashes settle. He promises she is free to vanish. Clara stares at the man who shattered her universe. Now standing like a scarred stone wall between her son and death, she asks the most shattering question. What about the boy? Who thinks this is just a holiday? Lorenzo's eyes go completely dark. He knows it is time to tell him everything. It is a heavy, undeniable truth about parenthood. You can only shield a frail heart from the dark, for so long before you must hand them the crushing weight of reality. I want you to look closely at this frame. This is the exact second the merciless king of the underworld shatters into a million jagged pieces. His broad shoulders physically cave in, his voice shakes, violently tearing away decades of thick armor. He confesses to Clara that he is finished running. He is done wearing his cruelty as a badge, and done echoing the toxic ghost of his father. Clara offers zero resistance. She does not hurl his past sins back at him. She just lets silent tears fall, whispering a fragile surrender. The brutal irony hangs heavy over the scene. It took a 5-year-old boy to break the soulless monster that rival families could never scratch. It reminds us that genuine love is the only force strong enough to tear down the walls we build around ourselves. The morning sun casts long shadows as we arrive at the climax we have all been dreading. We watch little Marco sink into the massive leather sofa, pressed firmly against his trembling mother. His sharp gray eyes dart between the two shattered adults as they try to sanitize a blood-soaked history. They tell him mistakes were made, but this man loves him. Marco absorbs this with a chilling gravity. You can almost hear the frantic drumming of Clara's heart through the screen. She is watching her innocent child swallow a mountain of family trauma. The room goes dead silent. The score fades out completely as the small boy slowly turns his piercing gaze to face the king of the criminal underworld. It is a stark reminder that the quietest moments in life often force us to carry the heaviest burdens of all. This 5-year-old interrogates the ruthless crime boss with a precision the authorities could only dream of. Marco looks him dead in the eye. He asks if he loved his mother, if he still does, and if he loved him before he ever drew a breath. Lorenzo's iron voice violently cracks. He confesses that a bleeding hole in his soul finally sealed shut the moment he saw his son. Then comes the real emotional crescendo. The tiny boy slides off the cushions, marches up to this towering instrument of death, and accepts him, but he has one condition. Lorenzo must never make his mother cry again. It is a fatal, breathtaking emotional strike. It teaches us a beautiful lesson about true power. The most unbreakable boundaries are often drawn by the innocent, who hold unimaginable sway over the damned. You and I have to appreciate the cinematic gravity of this sequence. Lorenzo, a phantom who barely blinks when staring down a loaded barrel, stands paralyzed with tears in his eyes. He chokes out a sacred vow. In response, little Marco extends his tiny hand for a solemn shake, sealing a pact like a syndicate treaty. Clara watches these mirrored gray eyes lock across an ocean of lost time, forming a delicate truce. Cut to 3 days later, and the lighting turns ice cold. Lorenzo stands before the criminal elite, presenting his heir. It is a flawlessly calculated chess maneuver. He frames his hidden family as a masterstroke of protection, spinning his fatal vulnerability into an absolute display of power. It shows how we can consciously transform our deepest weaknesses into our greatest armor. Lorenzo stares down the underworld, promising to rain hellfire upon anyone who dares to cast a shadow over his boy. The foolish rivals mistake this for weakness. The cunning ones shiver, realizing that a father defending his bloodline is a force of apocalyptic nature, yet Alessandro Ferraro arrogantly dismisses the omen. The camera then cuts to a vibrant sun-drenched Tuesday. Clara is finally exhaling, watching little Marco happily chase butterflies in the manicured garden. It is an absolute masterclass in building cinematic tension. We learn a haunting lesson about the rhythm of life in this seemingly quiet scene. The most terrifying tragedies almost always arrive wrapped in perfect golden peace, right before the cruel universe violently rips the ground out from beneath your feet. Without warning, deafening gunfire violently shreds the golden afternoon. The camera lens shakes with pure, unadulterated chaos. Guards scream as heavy rounds pulverize the estate windows, plunging the scene into a mother's ultimate nightmare. Clara does not hesitate. She snatches Marco and sprints toward the reinforced steel bunker Lorenzo forged for this exact apocalypse. She hurls the heavy vault door shut, sealing them in pitch blackness, and crushes her trembling child to her chest. She whispers hollow promises of safety she cannot even believe. Praying the iron holds, it reveals a profound, terrifying truth about human endurance. Time completely ceases to exist when you are trapped in the suffocating dark, waiting to see if everything you love will survive the next fragile breath. The heavy steel door shrieks on its hinges, revealing Lorenzo bathed in harsh, flickering light. He stands there like the Grim Reaper, his white shirt soaked black with blood. His face is a frozen mask of pure violence. But the second his cold eyes find Clara and Marco in the shadows, that terrifying aura dissolves. He breathes out, telling them Ferraro is dead. Clara loses all her strength, collapsing into uncontrollable sobs. Lorenzo falls to his knees beside them. He wraps his massive, trembling arms around his family, shielding them from the horror. And right in the center of this trauma, little Marco peers up and simply asks if his father is okay. It shows us that even in our absolute darkest moments, genuine connection and family are the only anchors that truly matter in the end. You and I know it is wild how children process the darkest moments. Lorenzo stares down at his son, swearing no one will ever hurt them again. Marco just blinks his wide eyes, nods, and innocently asks if they can go back to looking at bugs in the dirt tomorrow. It is such a staggeringly pure question that Lorenzo actually laughs. It is not his usual cold smirk, but a real rusty sound tearing from his chest. He promises his boy they will hunt for bugs every single day. The camera sweeps us into a brutal montage. For months, Lorenzo violently stabilizes his empire. Yet behind the doors of his home, his soul has visibly shifted. Children remind us that deep healing begins not with grand gestures, but with the simplest, most mundane joys of life, like playing in the dirt. Stick with me here, because this is where the story earns its aching emotional weight. Lorenzo ceases to be the untouchable ghost. Instead, the fearsome boss sits under the warm glow of the dining room chandelier every night. He watches the morning light catch Clara's face, quietly learning exactly how she takes her coffee. They do not magically fall back into bed, because both carry far too many bleeding scars for a cheap resolution. It is an agonizingly slow, beautiful cinematic burn. We see late-night whispers by the kitchen sink, fingers brushing by pure accident, and desperate glances shared while their son happily babbles. It proves a beautiful point about human nature. True redemption is never a quick fix. It is built patiently through quiet, daily, consistent efforts. We have all seen countless stories of trauma, but this frame shatters the usual mold. Clara finds Lorenzo alone in his shadow-soaked study, staring blindly at a faded photograph of his dead father. Lorenzo finally breaks the deafening silence. He confesses how that cruel man drilled it into his bones that caring for anyone was a fatal flaw. but standing in the quiet dark. Lorenzo realizes his father was never strong. He was just a pathetic coward, terrified of love. Clara steps into the dim light and firmly tells him he is nothing like his old man. Lorenzo admits that she and Marco rescued him from that empty hell. We learn a powerful truth right here. Real strength is never about closing your heart to the world, but having the raw courage to let love back in. Watch how beautifully the camera frames Clara in this pivotal moment. She steps right into his space. Close enough to see the deep lines of regret carved into his face, she refuses to offer him a fairy tale pardon. She looks right into his eyes and states clearly that his actions broke her, and total forgiveness might be impossible. But she is willing to try building something entirely new from the ashes. Her delicate fingers slowly trace the faded serpent tattoo curving along his neck, asking if he is truly ready. Lorenzo grips her hand tightly, pledging the rest of his natural life to her. This breathless vow reminds us of a hard-earned life lesson. Forgiveness is not about erasing the past. It is about choosing to build a new future from the broken pieces left behind. The poetic justice of returning to this garden is striking. The altar sits on the exact grass where Marco used to hunt for bugs, the very earth where they once dodged raining bullets. Marco marches down the aisle carrying the rings. Behind him, the battered old chief of security offers a rare jagged smile. Clara glides forward in pure white. She is not playing the part of a flawless maiden, but walking as a fierce survivor claiming her right to breathe again. Lorenzo waits for her under the sun. His sleeves are rolled high, leaving his heavy gang tattoos totally exposed. He refuses to wear the fake mask of a gentleman ever again. It is a beautiful truth that you never have to hide your ugliest scars to finally deserve a real and lasting fresh start. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? This is the bitterest pill of the narrative. Make no mistake, Lorenzo is a terrifying monster. He forged his syndicate through crushed bones, offering zero apologies. Yet, he loves this woman with an earth-shattering devotion. As Clara takes his scarred hands, she stares deeply into his cold steel eyes. In that silent beat, she sees the broken boy she fell for a lifetime ago. The last of her emotional fortresses crumbles into dust beneath the Italian sun. Her lips finally part, and she breathes the words she has held back for years. I love you. It leaves us with a haunting lesson about the human heart, sometimes. Finding true love requires us to drop our highest walls, just to see the fragile human being behind a lifetime of terrible mistakes. That simple declaration marks the exact second the unbreakable king of the underworld shatters. The ruthless crime boss, a man who built his empire on never showing weakness, just stands there. Hot tears spill down his cheeks under the harsh sun. He pulls her tight, whispering that she has always been his only light. It feels like a perfect cinematic ending. But let us look closer. Because you and I know their future is a guaranteed minefield. There will be rival syndicates, gunfire, and bitter fights over raising a boy in the shadow of the Mafia. Yet as the camera pulls away, the core truth remains. A happy ending is never about finding a life free of trouble. It is simply about finding the right person to stand by your side when the fires inevitably come. The screen fades to black, and 10 heavy years vanish in a heartbeat. The camera finds Marco at 15. And the innocent child who hunted for beetles is entirely gone. He sits in the shadows now, asking dangerous questions. He wants to understand the brutal weight of the family name, and the meaning behind the faded ink on his father's skin. Lorenzo sits across from his boy in the same oppressive study, where he once stared down his own father's ghost. The cycle of violence is a ruthless machine. Marco shares his mother's features, but his eyes hold Lorenzo's cold stare. Lorenzo finally admits his empire is built on blood. It is a stark reminder of a simple truth. We can never outrun our past choices, because the harsh reality of who we are always catches up to us. Lorenzo tells the boy this is the violent underworld he inherited. Marco does not blink. He leans forward into the lamplight and calmly states he has known the truth for years in this agonizing beat. Clara's illusion of keeping her son pure shatters like cheap glass. The poison of the syndicate was in the air all along. Lorenzo stares across the oak desk and realizes he is looking into a perfect mirror. Same blood, same chilling detachment. Then Marco tilts his head and asks the one question that pierces Lorenzo straight through the heart. He asks if his father regrets any of it. The suffocating silence that follows reveals a brutal reality. The absolute hardest mirror to look into is the one that reflects our own deepest flaws, staring back at us through our children. Memories bleed through Lorenzo's mind, his son's tiny hand clutching his own, Clara weeping in her white dress. The beautiful life he nearly drowned in mob blood. Lorenzo looks at his teenage boy and delivers the most twisted justification a father could speak. He leans in and whispers that he only regrets the moments he failed them, but he will never regret the violent path that brought them together. It is an act of staggering selfishness, disguised as pure romance. Marco, his face terrifyingly calm, simply nods in response. He asks what happens to the syndicate when his father is gone. He is asking for the keys to hell. This scene serves as a powerful reminder. Selfishness disguised as love will always demand a devastating price from the very people we claim to hold most dear. Let us truly look at the horror of what is happening here. Lorenzo tells his boy the choice is entirely his. He swears to protect him if he walks away, but watch closely how the trap springs shut. Lorenzo leans closer and offers the ultimate hook. He promises to teach Marco to rule the syndicate with wisdom, to protect their family name without losing his soul. It is a breathtaking, fatal lie. You cannot rule a kingdom of corpses and expect to keep your humanity intact. Lorenzo gently places his scarred hand over his son's smooth fingers. Marco stares down at the terrifying legacy waiting to consume him. The pure tragedy of this moment carries a heavy lesson. You can never truly protect someone from a toxic environment while you are actively inviting them to sit on its darkest throne. The camera pushes in close as Marco stares at his father's shattered knuckles. His voice is dangerously steady when he says he wants to learn the family business. You and I know the devastating truth. The very second that boy steps into the underworld shadows, his fate is sealed forever. Yet Lorenzo's chest swells with a foolish, tragic pride. He whispers that they will begin tomorrow, and the heavy wheel of generational trauma clicks perfectly back into place. Later, the scene shifts to the moonlit garden. Clara sits alone on the exact stone bench where they married, staring up at the cold stars. She has become the enabler who ultimately lost everything. Her silent grief is absolute proof that turning a blind eye to the ugly truth only ensures that history will repeat itself. Fast forward to the velvet darkness of the estate patio. Lorenzo sits heavily, the crushing weight of his sins pulling at his shoulders as he drops the news. He tells her the boy wants to learn. Clara barely blinks, replying that she already knows. She does not scream or pack her bags. She simply surrenders to the gravity of their life. Lorenzo confesses his bitter doubt, wishing a clean path for his son. Clara defends the shadows, insisting Marco is making his own choice. For now is all any of us have, she whispers, resting her tired head on his chest. It is a stunning, absolute defeat. The profound tragedy here is how easily we adapt to the dark. They watch the stars, while inside that cold stone fortress. Their teenage boy closes his eyes, drifting into dreams soaked in blood. The scene tries to wrap this lingering nightmare in a warm, cinematic glow. We are meant to believe Marco will face this bleak future, protected by a father who learned love is not a weakness, and a mother who remembered how to trust. Lorenzo leans in, whispering his love. Clara smiles through her exhaustion, echoing it back. They sit peacefully among the garden blooms, pretending their violent ghosts are finally buried. But let us look at the devastating reality together. They did not conquer the darkness of the crime syndicate. They simply opened the door and set a permanent place for it at their dinner table. They survived the storm, but victory always demands a terrible toll. They won the bloody battle to save their marriage, but they ultimately sacrificed their son's soul to do it.
Lorenzo was raised to believe that love is dangerous. His father taught him that caring about someone creates weakness, and weakness can be used by enemies. Because of this, Lorenzo builds his life around control, fear, and emotional distance. He becomes powerful, but he also becomes lonely. The story teaches a deep educational lesson. Love is not weakness. Love only becomes dangerous when it is treated as something shameful or hidden. Lorenzo's fear of love makes him cruel. Instead of trusting Clara, he pushes her away. Instead of protecting the relationship, he destroys it first so no one else can use it against him. This is a mistake many people make in real life. Some people avoid vulnerability because they believe it will make them look weak. They hide their feelings, reject help, and treat tenderness like a threat. But emotional walls do not create strength. They create isolation. Lorenzo begins to change when he sees his son. Marco becomes living proof of everything he lost by choosing fear. Suddenly, love is no longer an abstract weakness. It is a child with his eyes, asking honest questions and wanting to know his father. That moment forces Lorenzo to confront the truth. His empire may have made him feared, but it did not make him whole. His real transformation begins when he accepts responsibility. He does not deny what he did. He admits he was wrong. He admits he was a coward. He understands that loving Clara and Marco means more than claiming them. It means earning their trust. For viewers, the lesson is clear. Real love is not possession. Real love is responsibility. It means protecting without controlling, apologizing without excuses, and changing through action. Lorenzo becomes strongest, not when others fear him, but when he finally allows himself to love.